Hi, I'm Kelsey Vander Vliet Ranyard. I'm a birth mom, and I'm joined by Sara Easterly. She's an adoptee, and Lori Holden, an adoptive mom. And we're continuing our videos and our series today with a topic on adoption and money. We hear pretty often that people, a lot of times, the cost is obviously a huge obstacle to adoption. It's a huge problem in adoption. I think there's a lot of corruption that goes on with money in general, and especially in this field. And then also, we hear in criticisms of adoption, totally valid. I think we hear people want the money taken out of it. There's a lot of other Western countries that have adoption woven into their society like we do. They have made dramatic changes to their adoption field and taken the profit piece out, where we have not, and we are one of the only countries in the world to keep it in and to blow it up as much as we do. So we wanted to touch on this topic today, and yeah, I think, should I start? I think I've worked in agencies and adoption law firms, and money, especially as a birth mom, looking at the money piece is always really hard. Especially in the beginning, it was always really hard to stomach kind of the high cost, the high fees that are being collected for these services. And there's, I think there's a fine line that is often being crossed on when is this paying for a service and when does this paying for a commodity, a good, and when it's your own child, and I'm sure when you are the child and when you are adopting the child, it feels all very similar, as that we are paying for a baby. And where's the line on that, and what do you how is that for you going through that process, Lori?
Well, it's been 20 years. So in that amount of time, the landscape has changed dramatically because of the internet. And I think the internet has made connections a little bit, it's facilitated them, but it is at a huge cost. So I think you can see in the last 20 years, the price of an adoption has gone way up. And I do think in the days when I did it, when the internet wasn't quite as involved, what we paid was more for the services. And when people online or something say we need to get the money out of adoption, I think what they really mean is we need to get the profit out of adoption, because I do think money needs to be there to pay for the service of a home study. We don't want to not have a home study. We want every parent who is going to welcome a child into their home through adoption to have been vetted in some way. That's crucial. And those people who do that service need to be paid for that service. But it used to be that the agency would kind of market itself, and it needed to cover those costs to be in the yellow pages or have a web page or something like that, so that when there was a woman who was exploring or choosing to place her baby, she would know, this is a local place where I can go, and this is where I can, look at prospective parents who are in my community. But in those days, it wasn't all about showing up in a Google search, clear out in another state, with a state that has different laws and all of that. And so that has really tacked on, I think there's a competitive nature to that for organizations, not always agencies, to get that Google juice to deliver up. And so maybe, I know, Kelsey, you've looked into that a lot, but the bottom line to your question is it's gotten exponentially more expensive today to adopt, because perhaps of the effect of the internet and the competitive nature that agencies have now.
Yeah, for sure. Sara, what I'm trying to think of how to word this, but really I don't think that there's any safe way to word it. How does this make you feel? I mean, even though you were adopted, I'm not gonna out you on your age. I don't know how old you are anyways. 25 years ago, Sara.
Sure.
How does this make you feel, because the adoption cost has gone up so much, and it may not have been so crazy when you were born, but how, I mean, you have a window into how adoptees of today are going to feel about these astronomical costs to their parents paid to bring them home. So tell us.
I'm glad you're asking. It's interesting just even hearing this conversation. This is one of those questions I've never even asked. I don't know how much was paid for me, but there was a price paid, and it was a private adoption at the time that was, would not have been considered legal now. It was a gray market adoption. And so I guess the question I have is, when we're talking about these astronomical costs, what are we talking about? Like, what is that number?
Okay, so I started working in adoption 5 years ago. So back then I was working for an agency that was considered affordable. We were about 32 to 38,000 in that range, I think, I want to say. And that was affordable because if you looked at the competition in the state I was in, you had an attorney charging 50 to 75. And so they were the affordable ones. And then, the whole thing is, oh, there's the tax credit. So that covers half of your adoption expenses at that point. So not quite half, but like 40%, I would say. So then you're like, okay, so 32, okay, with the tax credit, yeah, you're paying for the services, there's the social workers, there's the home study, there's the post-placement services. They had a lot of classes, a lot of education that you could take advantage of. This wasn't like you pay this every year. This is a one-time thing. This is paying for the small cost of living expenses that was allowed by the state. And okay, like it made sense to me, but then, sorry. And then now I'm looking at agencies always over 40 grand in just a 5-year time span. You're always over 40 grand and you're pushing it. You're always pushing it more and more and more. So you're pushing it up to 50, 60,000. And what I'm seeing a lot of times is, yes, these prices are going up, but these costs are not justifiable.
Okay, well, Kelsey, thanks for that reality check. It's interesting that I've never asked that question. And I think it's one of those, I know a lot of adoptees do know that, but I think for me, I don't like thinking about, like, maybe I'm still partly in the fog in that. It's like that reduces us to commodities. And I get those services. That helps to think of the services too. So, I mean, obviously from an adoptee's perspective, we want a home study. We want, if adoption is like the inevitable and we have to be separated from our families for our best interests, then of course we want money going to education and a home study to make sure that this is a family that's going to be, serving us well. I think that's critical. I don't know that the education is where it needs to be. So I think I question, there are still a lot of people who aren't even, I think we're getting better, but who don't even recognize that adoption comes with a lot of trauma, and that the adoptee will have lifelong consequences for that. And I think that when you've got profits at stake and financial, there's the financial component, then I think that that education might brush that under the table still, because even just the advocacy work I've been doing for the last few years, I feel like I've talked some people out of fertility related decisions when they realize when I'm speaking openly about some of the effects. And so that tells me, I don't think that message is real rampant. It is maybe in our community, but outside of our community, to people who aren't familiar, I don't know that people are getting leveled with of, just so you know, this is going to be really hard. This is a parenting path that is going to be really, really hard. And it's going to be hard because your child is going to have trauma and the effects of trauma. So I guess, does that mean the cost of adoption needs to go up? I don't know. I mean, but the education needs to be better. I feel like it's not good enough. And then from the other perspective, I think, back to that trauma and the lifelong effects, where is the cost that you just gave? And I know I realize we're not looking at a line item budget here, but I don't think any of that factors in long-term support for the adoptee. So I'm lucky. I have insurance, and I have the financial means to cover the marriage therapy and the personal therapy that are required for me as an adoptee. And that's, I'm not saying I'm totally the problem, but you know what I'm saying? I mean, I think that's not factored into those. That's me, the adoptee, fronting those costs. The research I had to, the DNA kits that we buy, the DNA testing, or if we have to hire private investigators, costs to get our access to our records, those are all things that we personally pay for as adoptees that aren't covered in any of these costs that you're mentioning, that agencies are charging. So if adoption is in adoptee's best interest, then why isn't that factored in? And again, I'm not advocating for a higher cost, but it doesn't feel, when I look at the kind of line items, it doesn't feel like it's really about the adoptees.
I just wanted to kind of tag onto that, some of what the home study is, in case from your viewpoints you don't know, and also maybe adoptive parents who haven't really explored what the home study means. Because of the separation trauma that starts every adoption, Sarah, I think and Kelsey, you can correct me on this, but I think one of the purposes of the home study is to try to minimize more separation. So in my home study in my state of Colorado, we took an actual marriage test, because they're testing, is there a good likelihood that these people will stay together and there won't be another break? Financially, are these people okay? Now, we don't have to be rich. And of course, after we pay $60,000, we are not going to be rich. At the time, mine was, by the way, 20 years ago was about a quarter of that. So it's risen by that much. I'm hesitant to say this because everything I put out online, I imagine my children watching someday, and I want to make sure that they understand the context, and that is not a price tag. It would be kind of like if I had had a biological child, telling them the cost of the epidural or something, is what we pay for you. So the financial piece, the marriage stability piece, and then just your general health. And tied in with that is an age. Some agencies have an age requirement, and every once in a while online, I'll see somebody say, we're 50, we want to adopt. Do you know any agencies that will take us? And I don't want to make it personal to them, like you might just be out of luck, because statistically, actuarial insurance tables show that you're less likely to be healthy during the life of that child. And we're trying to prevent that child from having another separation, another loss. So I just wanted to outline, those are some of the reasons behind the home study, and that very valid expense, not a cost, but an expense.
And really, I think home studies are actually more on the expensive side in Colorado, where you're at, an agency only state. I think that not that really matters, but I do think that Colorado goes more in depth on home studies overall. Because typically in other states, home studies are like anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500. So it's really not it's one of the most inexpensive costs, and every state has their own laws on when you get that renewed. And that doesn't mean you have to always pay $2,500 every single year. Sometimes they last for 3 years. Sometimes an agency will say, hey, if you need a renewal in the next year, you pay like half of that, or they have some sort of fee that you pay just to, and it's not as much. It's not as grueling as the first time you get it. But really, I mean, home studies are one of those things you don't cut that corner. It isn't the corner, it's the meat. It's the heart of it, And so, but really like where these high fees come in is where we're seeing in the fee schedules for agencies and other adoption professionals, they're showing advertising fees to be a big one. I've seen anywhere from like $5,000 to $25,000 fee for your advertising costs for the agency. And that's interesting because you see a lot of people going and doing like this self-matching thing now, where they want to go advertise themselves online. They can make social media profiles. Maybe they put up a website, just any kind of, basic digital marketing. It's accessible. So I think like people see, oh, why would I pay $25,000 to an agency for my marketing? When really the agency is marketing the agency, because when they use that money, it goes towards like Google and maybe like Facebook ads. It goes towards those things to market the agency so that a mom in need will call the agency. And so I think they see that and they're like, well, they're not really advertising us, we're advertising everybody at that point. And the reason that these costs for Google and stuff have gone up so much is because you have these brokers, these middlemen who are like, hey, come to us instead of going to an agency. We're not licensed, but we can advertise you, because they think that's all you need. You just need a home study and you need advertising. You don't need any education. You don't need anything else. You just need to be advertised. So then they'll charge you $20,000. They might charge you a little more or a little less than what your agency would charge you for the advertising package. But then you don't have, they don't make you go to classes. They don't, you know what I mean? So I think in the eyes of a naive prospective adoptive parent, you're like, they're not making us do as much stuff. They don't have as many rules for us to follow. They're not telling me I have something to prove as a parent. I'm just going to go over there, pay the money, get the match, and be out the door, get an attorney later. So these brokers are operating with very low cost overhead to run their business. They're not paying social workers. They're not obviously doing the home study. They're not sending people out in the field. They're not paying for mileage for their social workers to go and meet with these moms. Half the time, they're not even verifying pregnancies. So there's a very high chance that you pay all this money and this woman's not even pregnant, or this woman is not, when they don't have a social worker walking through this with them, it's very possible that they're not getting the counseling they need to make an informed decision. So then everything goes haywire. There's no like protocol in place on what happens next.
Can I ask a question, Kelsey, about those? Are they facilitators, consultants?
Facilitators,
non-agencies?
I think the most important thing when you are talking about these like brokers, and the reason I've started calling them brokers is because people name themselves whatever they want. They're like, oh, I'm an advertiser, I'm a facilitator, I'm a consultant. And it's like, you can say whatever you think you are, but your actions are going to dictate what the law says you are. And so if you say you're a consultant, but you're working with moms and families and you're making matches together and you're doing all the work that an agency would do without a license, then you're a broker. You're brokering the match.
And a potential adoptive parent doesn't know those nuances. And so they think they're working perhaps with an agency, but they've actually fallen in with a broker.
Well,
so
and they think they're getting a cheaper adoption. They see, oh, I only have to pay $18,000 instead of 30 or 40. So, but then what they don't realize is they're paying for the match. They're not paying to be on with the agency, they're paying for a match. So then if that match falls through, they either don't get that money back at all, or they maybe get back half. They're not getting the money back. So then they're racking up their bill over and over again. And these brokers are taking every penny, putting it into Google, manipulating the Google search cost, and the price of adoption is skyrocketing.
And
Does that
that's,
make sense?
yeah, and that's so predatory for adoptive parents, and they may not even realize that they're being predated on. But that makes me think too, what's going on? How are these brokers filling their pipeline with placing mothers? Like, what are they doing
Because
to do?
they have the money to pay to be on the top spot of every Google page, of every Google search.
So walk us through how that works.
So pay-per-click advertising. Google's in a big lawsuit right now about price fixing anyway, so that's a whole another conversation for another day. But Google, sets the price. Say, back when I was working in an agency years ago, I think the price for a mother or for anybody to click on your link when after they searched "give my baby up for adoption," which was the most expensive click at the time, it was like $38 for that click. I bet you it's way more than that now because it's gone up so much. So, because I think I asked about a year ago what that would run, and that was like $60 per click. So if you have 10 moms click on that, you have a budget. So you say, my budget for the month is $600. So you're at the top of the page with your $600, and 10 moms in the month of March click on that link, your budget's up, you're not appearing on the page anymore. So the thing is maybe your small local agency has that budget, but because broker in maybe a different state has a budget of, I've seen one with $80,000 a month, you're not even on the first page with $600. You're not showing up in the search at all. You're not there. So you're not getting clicks, you're not getting calls. So then you're requiring your parents to pay in more money for advertising so that you can show up anywhere on the first page. You're not going to get to your $80,000 unless you're like a giant agency that's been around for a long time and is like in Texas. And I'm not going to name drop, but anyways, so you are not going to be on that page unless you're one of them, but you might get on the first page if you can compete in your region. It's really, they make it so complicated. It's really, if you just think of it as a pay to play, that's exactly what it is. And if you are running a business where you don't have to pay people that are licensed, qualified, have to keep up with their education, there's no prerequisites, you might be a one-man show, a two-man show, and you're not providing any real services except for matching, you're taking in tons of money to throw it back out at Google, and you're going to be on the first listing every single time.
So meanwhile,
and then you're going to drive the cost up for everyone else.
Meanwhile, my agency, which is ethical and local and providing education and providing resources for birth parents and options counseling, they don't even get seen when somebody.
They're not even on the page. No.
This is so depressing. And frightening, because it means the cost of adoption is only going up, and so that the agencies who are truly working in the child's best interests are suffering and invisible and not being found, and may not have the budget. And then again, we still haven't even touched those things that the adoptee is going to need.
This is not to say that all agencies are like suffering because of this, because some of them are taking advantage of it and are just asking for more and more money, and no one knows where that's going. I saw an agency in Arizona, they're charging like over $60 for every single adoption almost, and they, on their fee schedule, it says that they charge the living expenses money for the mom, which we can get to that later. And then they charge a fee where they tack on 10% of whatever you paid for living expenses is a fee that goes directly to them. What's that? That's nothing. That's pork. Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, no, I actually do think we should talk about, where I was going to go was different. So I think we should talk about that, the birth parent. Let's talk about the cost there and what money goes for that. That's an important angle as well.
Yeah, I think that's another line where we cross into a territory where is it helping her out, and where is it coercing, making an impossible situation for her to walk away from? Where is it really taking away her choice at the end? Every state sets living expenses laws, just like any other adoption law for domestic, private, independent adoption. Every state makes their own set of statutes, so there's no federal blanket law. So everybody's different, which creates like a system of manipulation a lot of times, because agencies know, like, oh, you're in Indiana, well, they only allow $4,000 in living expenses. Come to California, I guess. We don't have a limit. We don't have a cap. So you can come here, and they will pitch it like a vacation. Like, come out to sunny California, come out to Arizona, come out to Florida. And they do that a lot, actually. They fly women in and they take advantage of those state laws. They take her away from her support system. If you're an agency that's doing shady things, or a broker or anybody, like, that's a great strategy for you. Please don't take that advice though. So the living expenses discussion is a big one, because you have states with different standards of living, cost of living. You know, where I live in North Carolina, it's very different cost of living than where I was living out in Los Angeles. Housing is short everywhere right now too. That's another thing. It's the cost with inflation and housing shortage and people being kicked out of their places onto the streets. It's like, it's tough because you're put in a really hard situation, especially when, you know, moms are calling your agency and like they're in crisis. They need a place to go. So you want to be able to put them up in a safe place. You want them and their baby to be safe and have food and be able to survive and do more than survive. I mean, I think that's the very bare minimum. But when is it too much? When does it go too far? Because now I'm seeing, you know, when I placed in Indiana, the law was 3,000. It's now gone up to 4,000. But I do think that's a pretty safe number. Typically they distribute half of the money to you during pregnancy, and then the other half they're like, oh, well, if you actually place, then we can. That's another thing that's kind of like hanging a carrot in front of her. It's just, it like, on one hand it makes sense, and on the other hand it's like, there's a big problem here though. And then places like Pennsylvania, they have a law where the adoptive parents cannot actually pay the money to the mom. They can't pay for living expenses. So what agencies will do is they'll say, okay, pay $5,000 for living expenses for any adoption, and it goes into a pool, and then we're able to help her out as she needs it. I kind of think that's the most responsible way that I've seen it done. But then you have places like Florida, and you have places like California that you're seeing living expenses that are like $10,000, $15,000. I saw a $19,000 living expenses. That's you've got to outsource for resources, for housing resources. And then a lot of times, like, sometimes there's just nothing you can do. You have to draw the line somewhere and say, we're not going to sell this baby for $19,000 cash. We're not going to bribe you and barter with you. We have to put our foot down somewhere and say that's enough.
Yeah, and I would like to do an entire episode on pre-birth expenses at some point, because that's a really deep well we could dive into. But what I'm seeing as we're talking about this is that because I mean, I'm a free market champion. I think the free market has done wonderful things for human advancement, but it is not good for everything. And so this patchwork of states where adoption law is state by state, there's no federal regulation, there's no federal standardization. And so the free market is allowing for the like things to flow into the states where it's the least expensive or the least restrictive. And so you see these things like in the Paul Peterson case, where pregnant women are moved around to whatever stage of the pregnancy is most advantageous for them to be in this state for this, and this state to deliver, and this state to get through ICPC or whatever, you know, just all of those things, because we don't have, we're back to money in adoption, we don't have financial and ethical standards across all states.
Yeah, you're right, Lori. I think a big part of pursuing adoption, whether you're an adoptive parent or expectant parent, birth parent, you're like being herded around with like a ring in your nose, because you don't, it's such a confusing system. You don't know. A lot of times like laws are not written in layman's terms either. So like, even if you look up your state laws, you can still be looking at it like, what does this even mean? And it's written that way on purpose because it's supposed to be confusing. And so it is tough to know who to trust, what you're actually paying for. I guess my best advice to like prospective adoptive parents, if you're looking through an agency's fee schedule, you want to be looking for justifiable fees, reasonable and justifiable fees. Like don't pay a 10% living expense fee. That doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of stuff. The advertising fee, I would definitely be asking questions. What is this going to? How do you justify this $20,000 advertising fee? How do you break this down and tell me where this money is going? Is this just going into Google, or, you know, are they even using that money to advertise on Google? Because I have seen some agencies kind of give up on that avenue as like, we're not going to shell out that kind of money every month. That's ridiculous. So do they have connections in their community? Like, how are they doing this? And is it exploitative or not? A lot of times it is.
Sarah, I just want to know if you've got any new thoughts on this. This is a new world for you because you were adopted in the closed adoption era and people weren't matching this way. It was all done behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm a maybe overly idealistic wanting to fix things. So I'm like, what do we do? Well, how do we shut down these brokers? Like it, you know, my heart hurts because it is not in the child's best interest. You know, so I think I am just so worried about the adoptees in this situation. So when it's all business, it just, yeah. And I think a lot of, you know, money is needed. You know, it's obviously you need money to make the world go round. So money is required, but getting it in the right places and cleaning up, you know, this industry. I mean, it's an industry, and, you know, we talked about that in our last episode, but this is when the rose-colored glasses come off, and it's like, this isn't this rainbows, unicorns, adoption, and it's a win-win for everybody. Like, I think, you know, that's not what this is. And so it's difficult to look at. And I guess I'm like, how do we work together, all of us, to affect change? And I do think, you know, Lori, I think as we've talked about it lots of times, adoptive parents ultimately hold the power, because adoptees are babies in this situation. And certainly we adult adoptees can help with lobbying and, you know, trying to affect change, which is what we're doing. And birth parents as well can do that on the other side, but when they're in crisis, they're not in a position of power. So it's adoptive parents, you know, those of you who are watching, thank you for listening. And then what can be done? You know, I think like you suggested, Kelsey, just asking to see those line items and look at that. But what else? I mean, what else can be done by those who have the ultimate power? Because adoptive parents are the customers, right? If we're talking, if this is like, if we're just taking if we're talking facts of the industry, and then adoptive parents as the customers will be able, customers can create change and affect things, right? So what do we recommend happens?
And I think one of the flaws of this free market that we still have this in the free market where it's subject to supply and demand, which does commodify a human being, that the free market kind of is predicated on rational actors. And when adoptive parents have baby fever and they don't know what they don't know, they are not rational actors. They want a baby, they want it fast, and they want it fast first and cheap second. And they'll cut corners if they need to because it's $60,000. They want to fill their arms and then they'll think because they have the fever. And while you have a fever, you can't make rational long-term decisions that are good for the long term. So I think it needs regulation. I think it needs to be we need to somehow modify that free market model, the freedom to do whatever works. And people don't know what they don't know. So I mean, my wish for this particular video would be that somehow it gets SEO'd. I don't know exactly how to do that, but we're going to try, so that if everybody who was Googling at the very beginning of their journey, whether they're an adoptive parent or a woman who is in an unplanned pregnancy and she's trying to figure out what her options are, I wish they would come here. I wish they would know these things here. I wish they would know how to choose an ethical agency with the right services and avoid the brokers.
I think another thing that's really hard for a lot of my audience to typically hear, but it's something that I really believe is true, is that some people are not going to adopt. There is the number of adoptions are declining, and it's going to keep continuing that way. And I think that the more that the competition, like, it can get vicious at times. And so I think that creates a harmful space when people are competing for human lives. And so I think that there are some people, and I have received messages, I would say in the past year or so, I've received messages from people saying, like, you know, we really thought it over, and after listening to you and some other you know, adoptees and birth parents and other adoptive parents, we've decided, like, we're not going to adopt, and we're going to find a different way to be a family, or find a different way to give parental love and somehow, but we're not going to adopt through this system. We're not going to participate. And I think that that's a difficult thing, but when we talk about, you know, the entitlement of parenthood and things that are just harmful, and no doubt, like, hard, because I can't imagine being told, like, no, you can't have children, this is not going to be your path in life. I can't imagine, but it's kind of just the ugly truth. And some people are not going to bring children home. We want to give advice and help and tips to people that if they do it the right way. But the fact is that it's just not going to happen for everyone. And adoption should be first and foremost about finding a family for a child, and not finding a child for a family.
Yeah. To quote Dr. Joyce Pavo, I always want to say Joyce. Yeah.
Kelsey, at the beginning, you mentioned other countries are changing, and when we're speaking about regulation, so I think we should just quickly touch on what countries are doing it well, and then also recognize that we've been talking about domestic adoption in this conversation for the most part, and when there is a limited supply of babies for adoption, then that does affect the corruption and the in the practices in other countries and with an international adoption, and that demand just other countries can, you know, anyway, that's a whole, like, I feel like I need to hold up Catherine Joyce's The Child Catchers at this point. But I think we should just quickly touch on that too. So I guess, what countries are locking down and reforming how they do adoption?
I don't know if I can say that there's any country that's like they're doing a great job or doing well. I think there's flaws in every country's system. And I don't want to sit here and be like, Europe is doing such a better job than us. I know my husband would love it if I said that because he's British, but I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to give him the satisfaction. I think that they've cleaned up a lot. I think they've cleaned up profit first and foremost. But then I think there's other flaws. Like I don't really trust giving it to the state to handle because they really have done a botched job with foster system stuff, and I just don't trust that they would handle it smoothly by any means. But I think there's great things to take from other countries' adoption policy. I think there's good takeaways. I think Australia has done a pretty good job. The UK has handled it pretty differently. I would say they do handle it all through the state. But it is a little backwards in a lot of ways too, of with like openness and stuff like that. And a lot of these countries too, they have really ugly histories with adoption, just like we do. Some are just kind of grotesque, and we're not excused from that. Canada has cleaned up theirs, although they have a very ugly history, especially with like Indigenous adoptions, and South Africa has an ugly history as well, but they have cleaned it up. Ireland has cleaned it up. They have a very ugly history, especially with the mother baby homes. So yeah, I think and you know, apologies are so they seem so like basic to talk about, but apologies, like Australia issued an apology to all the mothers and the children that they shipped from each other. But I think the United States doesn't really do apologies at all. So I think the United States kind of sees apologies as a sign of weakness, but it would really do them a lot of good if they would even just start there as a baseline to apologize, because I think like reckoning with the mistakes and the wrongs done to its own people of the past is a great first step to getting on a path of fixing things and mending the system. If we don't acknowledge what's wrong, how can we really begin to fix it from a policy level? Kind of my philosophy. So yeah, I think, yeah, we can take things from different, and we also all have different cultures. So what works for one country might not work for us. But in such a consumerist society that we have in the United States, I think it's a really hard thing for people to look at it and be like, well, how would we do that? And I think it does a lot of good to look at other people that are getting it a little more right than we are, and kind of see what's working for you and what might work for us. So yeah,
I think from the adopting parents' perspective, you know, when we get off the infertility train, we're told, well, you can just adopt, and then we find out there's nothing just about it. So for parents, for prospective parents who are looking to get off the adopt domestically train, for all the reasons that we've mentioned, there's nothing easy about, well, we'll just go international, or we'll just go through the foster care system or the child welfare system. Each one of those has, well, the root of things in adoption is it comes from desperation. Everybody comes to it through some sort of need or urgent need, especially like when we're talking about the Ukraine right now, and Rwanda before it, and South Korea a while ago, and all of those that Catherine Joyce outlines in Child Catchers, which I want to put in the show notes. So when there's that desperation, that just opens the doors for people to take advantage of desperate situations. And so it just requires such a level of vigilance and caution that if you have baby fever, it's really hard to summon that.
I think adoption is really unique in that way too, as an industry, which it is. It's unique in that it has people of desperation coming in from all sides. You have, if you look at it from like a supply demand model, which is disgusting, but it is what it is. That's what we have created. you have the supply coming in a desperate way and the demand coming in a desperate way. And it just, when there's such a, it's like free market space and no enforcement and very little regulation around these practices, it just creates such a huge margin for abuse. And that's what we see. So on that note, I think like people can easily get bogged down by this conversation. I think it is sad, don't get me wrong. I mean, we definitely have a lot of work to do, but there's a new organization coming in the coming months that is looking to combat these things, and it is called Adopt Change. It is a branch off of the company I work for called Adopt Match, and we're really trying to bring attention to these issues and find solutions through the public, through legislation, and through best practices with professionals. So stay tuned for Adopt Change, because it'll have resources, and our aim is transparency, really, and to help the general public understand these issues and comprehend them, because they are made to be very confusing, and we want to educate on those things.
Can you say a little bit about Adopt Match too?
Yeah, Adopt Match was created, well, I want to say 5 years ago, but I could be wrong. I didn't work for them 5 years ago, but they were created 5-6 years ago to kind of combat this very issue, the rising cost of adoption, and to help people find ethical professionals who are doing, who can't afford to pay those high fees for advertising and can't show up on the page, but they're doing really great work and they deserve to be seen. We're an app. Women who are pregnant can get on our app or on our website to look through the families that are with these ethical partners. We don't facilitate the matches. We just kind of host the space. And when mothers contact us, they get routed to the professional that's in their area that can provide on the ground local support, resources, stuff like that. So while we're called Adopt Match, we don't actually match anyone. We just kind of host the space so they can find the type of family that they may be looking for, and also get paired with an awesome professional at the same time. So
from an adoptive parent standpoint, is Adopt Match a place you could go if you're wanting to find an approved agency who meets some requirements? That would be a place.
I always tell people to start at our website and look at our approved partners, because we do have approved partners in quite a few states. We both attorneys and agencies. We don't allow unlicensed players to come on our website. We don't allow them to be a part of our network. So yeah.
And that's adoptmatch.com, or the app is called Adopt Match.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So anything else, ladies?
We covered a lot of ground, and there's still so much more.
Yeah, we do want to hear from any of our listeners, and if you want to drop questions or comments, do that, and we hope to cover any topics that you're interested in the future. So thanks for listening.
Thank you both.